Hello, everyone who watches my videos. I got the flu today. Caught it or something. Somehow I was given it. Don't know how, but my brother caught it, and now I have it. But I've been reading this book. It's called The Invisible, The Invisible Rainbow by that Arthur Firstenberg dude. Here. Recommend buying this book, but she goes into detail about why 5G technology is going to be the death of everyone. Everyone's going to be sick, and why since pretty much 1890 we've been dealing with electromagnetic sicknesses, and they've been recoining terms, changing the name of what it really is. The name they gave it back then was called, I don't have it. I don't hear my fucking voice. Whatever, I'll just get to it. I'll write it in the description. Influenza is an electrical disease. In 1889, most historians agree the modern electrical age opened. And in 1889, as if the heavens had suddenly opened as well, doctors in Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia were overwhelmed by a flood of critically ill patients suffering from a strange disease that seemed to have come like a thunderbolt from nowhere. A disease that many of these doctors had never seen before. That disease was influenza, and that pandemic lasted 4 continuous years and killed at least 1 million people. Great. 1889 is a year man-made electrical disturbances of the Earth's atmosphere took on a global other than local character. In that year, the Edison General Electric Company was incorporated and the Westinghouse Electric Company was reorganized as the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. In that year, Westinghouse acquired Tesla's alternating current patents and put them to use in its generating stations, which grew to 150 in number in 1889 and to 301 in 1890. United Kingdom amendment of the Electric Lighting Act in 1888 ceased regulations on the electric power industry and made central power stations development commercial feasibility for the first time. And in 1889, the Society of Telegraph Engineers and Electricians changed its name to the now more appropriate Institute for Electrical Engineers. In 1889, 61 producers in 10 countries were manufacturing incandescent lamps, and American and Europe companies were installing plants in Central and South America. In that year, Scientific America reported that, so far as we know, every city in the United States is provided with an arc and incandescent illumination, and the introduction of electric lighting is rapidly extending to the smaller towns. Also in that year, Charles Dana, writing in the medical record, reported a new class of injuries previously produced only by lightning. They were due, he said, to the extraordinary increase now going on in the practical application of electricity. Nearly 100 million being already invested in lights and power alone. Influenza is an electrical disease. Excuse me. There is the perfect time to make a video about this. I'm suffering from it. Suddenly and inexplicably, influenza, whose descriptions have remained constant for thousands of years, changed its character in 1889. Flu had seized most of England in November 1847, over half a century earlier. The last flu epidemic in the United States had raged in the winter of 1874 to 1875. Since ancient times, influenza had been known as a capricarious, unpredictable disease. A wild animal that came from nowhere, terrorized whole populations at once without warning and without a schedule, and disappeared as suddenly and mysteriously as it had arrived. Not to be seen again for years or decades. It behaved unlike any other illness and thought not to be contagious, and received this name because its comings and goings were said to be governed by the influence of the stars. Right. But in 1889, influenza was tamed. From that year forward, it would be present always in every part of the world. It would vanish mysteriously as before, but it could be counted on its return at more or less the same time the following year. And it has never been absent since. Like anxiety disorder, that's another electrical disorder that was created by using electrical wires and the low pulse. But anyways, I digress. I just wanted to say that because I didn't cover that. Like, I'm on page 80, read this, and they already covered a lot. So, anyways, back to the book. Like anxiety disorder, influenza is so common and so seemingly familiar that a thorough view of its history is necessary to unmask this stranger and convey the enormity of the public health disaster that occurred more than 125 years ago. It's not that we don't know enough about the influenza virus. We know more than enough. The microscopic virus associated with this disease has been so exhaustively studied that scientists know more about its tiny life cycle than about any other single microorganism. But this has been a reason to ignore many unusual facts about the disease, including the fact that it's not contagious. In 2001, Canadian astronomer Ken Tapping, together with two British Columbia physicians, were the latest scientists to confirm yet again that for at least the last 3 centuries, influenza epidemics have been most likely to occur during peaks of solar magnetic activity, that is, at the height of each 11-year sun cycle. Such a trend is not the only aspect of this disease that has long puzzled virologists. In 1992, one of the world's authorities on the ethnology of influenza, excuse me, I'm so sorry, R. Edgar Hope Simpson, published a book in which he reviewed the essential known facts and pointed out that they did not support a mode of transmission by direct human-to-human contact. Hope Simpson had been perplexed by influenza for a long time. In fact, ever since he had treated its victims as a young general practitioner in Dorset, England, during the 1932-33 epidemic, the very epidemic during which the virus that is associated with disease in humans was first isolated. But during his 71-year career, Hope Simpson questions were never answered. The sudden explosion of information about the nature of the virus and its antigenic reactions in the human host, he wrote in 1992, had only added to the features calling for an explanation. Why is influenza seasonal? He still wondered. Why is influenza almost completely absent except during a few weeks or months of an epidemic? Why do flu epidemics end? Why don't out-of-season epidemics spread? How do epidemics explode over whole countries at once and disappear just as miraculously as if suddenly prohibited? He could not figure out how a virus could possibly behave like this. Why does flu or so often target young adults and spare infants and the elderly? How is it possible that the flu epidemics traveled at the same blinding speed in past centuries as they do today? How does the virus accomplish its so-called vanishing trick? This refers to the fact that when a new strain of the virus appears, the old strain, between one season and the next, has vanished completely, all over the world at once. Hope Simpson listed 21 separate facts about influenza that puzzled him, and that seemed to defy explanation of one assumed that it was spread by direct contact. He finally received a theory that was first put forward by Rachel Shope, the researcher who isolated the first flu virus in pigs in 1931, and who also did not believe that the explosive nature of many outbreaks could be explained by direct contagion. Shope, and later Hope Simpson, proposed that the flu is not in fact spread from person to person or pig to pig. in the normal way, but that instead remains latent in human or swine carriers, who are scattered in large numbers throughout their communities until the virus is reactivated by an environmental trigger of some sort. Hope Simpson further proposed that the trigger is connected to seasonal variations in solar radiation, and that it may be electromagnetic in nature, as a good many of his predecessors during the previous 2 centuries had suggested. When Hope Simpson was young and beginning his practice in Dorset, a Danish physician named Johann Meige, at the end of a long and distinguished career, had just published a monograph in which he too showed that influenza pandemics tend to occur during years of maximum solar activity, and further that the yearly number of cases of flu in Denmark rose and fell with the number of sunspots. In an era in which epidemiology had become nothing more than a search for microbes, Meige admitted and knew already from hard experiences that he who dances out of line risks having his feet stomped on. But he was certain that influenza had something to do with electricity, and he had come to this conviction in the same way I did, from personal experience. That's Arthur Firstenberg talking. Or Arthur My apologies for misrepresenting his name. In 1904 and 1905, Meige had kept a careful diary of his health from 9 months, and he later compared it to records of the electrical potential of the atmosphere, which he had recorded 3 times a day for 10 years as part of another project. It turned out that his incapacitating migraine-like headaches, which he had always known were connected to changes in the weather, almost always fell on the day of, or one day before, a sudden severe rise or drop in the value of the atmospheric voltage. I used to get these same migraines. Anyways, I digress. But headaches were not the only effects. On the days of such electrical turmoil, almost without expectation, his sleep was broken and unrestful, and he was bothered with dizziness, irritable mood, a feeling of confusion, buzzing, sensations in the head, pressure in the chest, and an irregular heartbeat. And sometimes he wrote, "My condition had the character of a threatening influenza attack, which in every case was not essentially different from the onset of an actual attack of that illness." Others who have connected influenza with sunspots or atmospheric electricity, including John Young, 2006, Fred Hoyle, 1990, J. H. Douglas Webster, 1940, Alexander Shevesky, 1936, C. Conyers Morel, 1936, W. M. Houston, 1936, Sir William Hamer, 1936, Gunnar Edstrom, 1935, Clifford Gill, 1928, C. M. Richter, 1921, Willie Helpach, 1911, Veer Mitchell, 1893, Charles Dana, 1890, Louise Fiscal Bison, 1890, Ludwig Buzoni, 1841, Johann Schleuen, 1841, and Noah Webster, 1799. How about them apples? In 1836, Heinrich Schweitz observed that all psychological processes produced electricity, and proposed that an electrical disturbance of the atmosphere may prevent the body from discharging it. He repeated the then common belief that the accumulation of electricity within the body causes the symptoms of influenza. No one has yet disproven this. It is of interest that between 1645 and 1715, a period astronomers call the Maunder Minimum, when the sun was so quiet that virtually no sunspots were to be seen, and no auroras graced polar nights, during which, according to native Canadian tradition, the people were deserted by the lights from the sky. There were also no worldwide pandemics of flu. This is why the sun's real dark. Anyways. In 1715, sunspots reappeared suddenly after a lifetime's absence. In 1716, the famous English astronomer Sir Edmund Halley, at 60 years of age, published a dramatic description of the northern lights. It was the first time he had ever seen them, but the sun was still not fully active. As though it had woken up after a long sleep, it stretched its legs, yawned, and lay down again after displaying only half the number of sunspots that it shows us today at the peak of each 11-year solar cycle. It wasn't until 1727 that the sunspot number surpassed 100 for the first time in over a century. And in 1728, influenza arrived in waves over the surface of the earth. The first flu pandemic in almost 150 years. See, it's all the sun. More universal and enduring than any in previously recorded history, that pandemic appeared on every continent, became more violent in 1732, and by some reports lasted until 1738, the peak of the next solar cycle. John Hexham, who practiced medicine in Plymouth, England, wrote in 1733 that scare anyone had escaped it. He added that there was a madness among dogs. The horses were seized with the cathara before mankind. And a gentleman averred to me that some birds, particularly the sparrows, left the place where he was during the sickness. An observer in Edinburgh reported that some people had fevers for 60 continuous days, and that others, not sick, died suddenly. By one estimate, some 2 million people worldwide perished in that pandemic. Wow. If influenza is primary electrical disease, or response to electrical disturbance of the atmosphere, then it is not contagious in the ordinary sense. The patterns of this epidemic should prove this, and they do. For example, the deadly 1889 pandemic began in a number of widely scattered parts of the world. Severe outbreaks reported in May of that year simultaneously in Bukhara, Uzbekistan, Greenland, and northern Alberta. Flu was reported in July in Philadelphia and in Hilston, a remote town in Australia, and in August of the Balkans. This pattern began at odds with prevailing theories. Many historians had pretended that the 1889 pandemic didn't really start until it had seized the western steppes of Siberia at the end of September, and that it then spread in an orderly fashion from there outward throughout the rest of the world, person to person by contagion. But the trouble is that the disease still would have had to travel faster than the trains or ships of the time. It reached Moscow and St. Petersburg during the 3rd or 4th week of October, but by then influenza had already been reported in Durban, South Africa, and Edinburgh, Scotland, New Brunswick, Canada, Cairo, Paris, Berlin, and Jamaica were reporting epidemics in November, London, Ontario on December, Stockholm on December 9th, New York on December 11th, Rome on December 12th, Madrid on December 13th, and Belgrade on December 15th. Influenza struck explosively, unpredictably over in waves until the early 1894. It was as if something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere, as if brush fires were being ignited by some unknown vandal randomly everywhere in the world. One observer in East Central Africa, which was struck in September 1890, asserted that influenza had never before appeared in that part of Africa at all, not within the memory of the oldest living inhabitants. Influenza, said Dr. Benjamin Lee of the Pennsylvania State Board of Health, spreads like a flood, inundating whole sections in an hour. It is scarcely conceivable that a disease which spreads with such astonishing rapidity goes through the process of redevelopment in each person infected. It is only communicated from person to person or by infected articles. Influenza works its caprice not only on land but at sea. With today's spread of travel, this is no longer obvious. But in previous centuries, when sailors were attacked with influenza weeks or even months out of their last port of call, it was something to remember. In 1894, Charles Creighton described 15 separate historical instances where entire ships, or even many ships in a naval fleet, were seized by the illness far from landfall, as if they had sailed into an influenza fog, only to discover in some cases upon arriving at the next port that influenza had broken out on the land at the same time. Crichton added one report from the contemporary pandemic. The merchant ship Wellington had sailed with its small crew from London on December 19th, 1891, bound for Lyttelton, New Zealand. On the 26th of March, after over 3 months at sea, the captain was suddenly shaken by intense febrile illness. Upon arriving at Lyttelton on April 2nd, the pilot, coming on board from the captain, ill in his breath, and on being told the symptoms at once, said, "It's the influenza. I have just had it myself." In 1857, the report was so compelling that William Beveridge included it in his 1975 textbook on influenza. The English warship Archne was cruising off the coast of Cuba without any contact with land. No less than 114 men out of the crew of 149 fell ill with influenza, and only later was learnt that there had been outbreaks in Cuba at the same time. The spread at which influenza travels and its random and simultaneous pattern of spread has perplexed scientists for centuries. It has been the most compelling reason for some to continue to suspect atmospheric electricity as the cause, despite the known presence of an extensive studied virus. Here is a sampling of opinion, old and modern. Perhaps no disease has ever been observed to affect so many people in so short a time as influenza. Almost a whole city, town, or neighborhood becoming afflicted in a few days, indeed much sooner than could be supposed to spread from contagion. Mercatus relates that when it prevailed in Spain in 1557, the greatest part of the people were seized in one day. Dr. Glass says when it was rife in Exeter in 1729, 2,000 were attacked in one single night. Shadrach Rickerson, MD, 1808. A Brief History of Influenza. That's the book it came from. The simple fact is to be recollected that the epidemic affects a whole region in the space of a week, nay, a whole continent as large as North America, together with all the West Indies in the course of a few weeks, where the inhabitants over such a vast extent of country could not, within so short a lapse of time, have had the least communication or intercourse whatsoever. This fact alone is sufficient to put all idea of it being propagated by contagion from one individual to another out of the question. Alexander Jones, medical doctor. Philadelphia Journal of the Medical and Physical Sciences, 1827. Here's another quote. Unlike cholera, it outstrips in its course the speed of human intercourse. Theophilus Thomason, MD, 1852. Annals of Influence or Epidemic. There's a lot of quotes here. Catarrhal fever in Great Britain. Contagion alone is inadequate to explain the sudden outbreak of the disease in widely distant countries at the same time, and the curious way in which it has been known to attack the crews of ships at sea, where communication with infected places or persons was out of the question. Sir Morrell Mackenzie, MD, 1893. These are all statements. Usually influenza travels at the same speed as man, but at times it apparently breaks out simultaneously in widely separated parts of the globe. Jorgen Birkeland, Microbiology and Man, 1949. Here's another one. Before 1918, there are records of two other major epidemics of influenza in North America during the past 2 centuries. The first of these occurred in 1789, the year in which George Washington was inaugurated president. The first steamboat did not cross the Atlantic until 1819, and the first steam train did not run until 1830. Thus, this outbreak occurred when man's fastest convenience was the galloping horse. Despite this fact, the influenza outbreak of 1789 spread with great rapidity, many times faster and many times farther than a horse could gallop. James Broadley III, medical doctor, and Guy Harvey, MD, 1976. 2 centuries of American medicine. It's a pretty modern book. Well, here's two more modern ones. Flu virus may be communicated from person to person in droplets of moisture from the respiratory tract. However, direct communication cannot account for simultaneous outbreaks of influenza in widely separated places. So there's a communication here. It's super meta. Excuse me. Why have epidemic patterns in Great Britain not altered in 4 centuries that have seen great increases in the speed of human transport? John D. Cannell, MD, 2008, on the epidemiology of influenza. It was published in a journal, 2008. That's the end of the quotes. On to further read. The role of the virus, which infects only the respiratory tract, has baffled some virologists because influenza is not only or even mainly a respiratory disease. Why the headache, the eye pain, the muscle soreness, the prostration, the occasional visual impairment, the reports of encephalitis, myocarditis, and precarditis. Guys, I butchered those 3 words, forgive me. Why the abortions, stillbirths, and birth defects. In the first wave of the pandemic in 1889, the England neurological symptoms were most often prominent and respiratory symptoms absent. Most of the medical officer Regner's 239 flu patients at Erlangen, Bavaria, had neurological and cardiovascular symptoms, but no respiratory diseases. Nearly 1/4 of the 41,000 cases of flu reported in Pennsylvania as of May 1st, 1890, were classified as primary neurological and not respiratory. Few of David Breckenridge's patients in Edinburgh or Julius Althaus' patient in London had respiratory symptoms. Instead, they had dizziness, insomnia, indigestion, constipation, vomiting, and diarrhea, utter prostration of mental and bodily strength, neuralgia, delirium, coma, and convulsions. Upon recovery, many were left with neurasthenia, or even paralysis or epilepsy. Anton Schmitz published an article titled Insanity After Influenza and concluded that influenza was primarily an epidemic nervous disease. C.H. Hughes called influenza a toxis neurosis. Morrell Mackenzie agreed. In my opinion, this is him stating his agreement. In my opinion, the answer to the riddle of influenza is poisoned nerves. In some cases, it seizes on that part of the nervous system which governs the machinery of respiration, in others on that which presides over digestive function, in others again it seems, as it were, to run up and down the nervous keyboard, jarring the delicate mechanisms and stirring up disorder and pain in different parts of the body, with what almost seems malicious caprice. As the nourishment of every tissue and organ in the body is under the direct control of the nervous system, It follows that anything which affects the later has a prejudicial effect on the former. Hence, it is not surprising that influenza, in many cases, leaves its mark in damaged structure. Not only the lungs, but the kidneys, the heart, and other internal organs and nervous matter itself may suffer in this way. Sorry. Sometimes I can't pause it fast enough. Insane asylums filled up with patients who had influenza, people suffering variously from profound depression, mania, paranoia, or hallucinations. The number of admissions reached unprecedented proportions. Reporter Albert Lee Bidet at the Beograd Lunatic Asylum at Bourgois in 1891. Admissions for the year exceeded those of any previous year, 1891. Reported Thomas Colston, superintending physician of the Royal Edinburgh Asylum for the Insane in 1892. No epidemic of any disease on record has such mental effects, he wrote in 1893. Althaus reviewed scores of articles about psychosis after influenza, and his stories of hundreds of his own and others' patients who had gone insane after the flu during the previous 3 years. He was perplexed by the fact that the majority of psychosis after influenza were developing in men and women in the prime of their life, between the ages of 21 and 50, that they were most likely to occur only after mild or slight cases of the disease, and that more than 1/3 of these people had not yet registered their sanity. The frequent lack of respiratory illnesses was also noted in the even deadlier 1918 pandemic. In his 1978 textbook, Beveridge, who had lived through it, wrote that half of all influenza patients in the pandemic did not have initial symptoms of nasal discharge, sneezing, or sore throat. The age distribution is also wrong for contagion. In other kinds of infectious diseases like measles and mumps, the more aggressive a strain of virus is, and the faster it spreads, the more rapidly adults build up immunity, and the younger the population that gets it every year. According to Hope Simpson, this means that between pandemics, influenza should be attacking mainly very young children, but influenza keeps on stubbornly targeting adults. The average age is almost always between 20 and 40. Whether during a pandemic or not, the year 1889 was no exception. Influenza fell preferentially vigorous young adults in the prime of their life, as if it were maliciously choosing the strongest instead of the weakest out of our species. Then there is the confusion about animal infection, which are so much in the news year after year, scaring us all about catching influenza from swine or birds. But inconvenient fact is that throughout history, for thousands of years, all sorts of animals have caught the flu at the same time as humans. When the army of King Carloman of Bavaria was seized by influenza in 1876, the same disease also decimated the dogs and the birds. In later epidemics, up to and including the 12th century, illness was commonly reported to break out among dogs, cats, horses, mules, sheep, cows, birds, deer, rabbit, and even fish at the same time as humans. Beveridge listed 12 epidemics during the 8th and 19th centuries in which horses caught the flu, usually 1 or 2 months before the humans. In fact, this association was considered so reliable that in early December 1889, Symes Thomas, observing flu-like illness in British horses, wrote to the British Medical Journal, predicting an imminent outbreak in humans, a forecast which shortly proved true. During the 1919 pandemic, monkeys and baboons perished in great numbers in South Africa and Madagascar, sheep in the northwest England, horses in France, moose in northern Canada, and buffalo in Yellowstone. There's no mystery here. We're not catching the flu from animals, nor are they from us. If influenza is caused by abnormal electromagnetic conditions in the atmosphere, that affects all living things at the same time, including living things that don't share the same viruses or live closely with one another. The obstacle to unmasking the stranger that is influenza is the fact that it is two different things. Influenza is a virus and is also a clinical illness. The confusion comes about because since 1933, human influenza has been defined by the organism that was discovered in that year, and not by clinical symptoms. If an epidemic strikes and you come down with the same diseases as everyone else, but an influenza virus can't be isolated from your throat and you don't develop antibodies to one, then you are said not to have influenza. But the fact is that although influenza viruses are associated in some way with disease epidemics, they have never been shown to cause them. 17 Years of Surveillance by Hope Simpson in and around the community of Christiansted, England, revealed that despite popular belief, influenza is not readily communicated from one person to another within a household. Well, that's odd because I got it from my brother, but I guess I did. 7% of the time, even during the Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1968, only one person in a household would get the flu. If a second person had the flu, both often caught it the same day, which meant that they did not catch it from each other. Sometimes different minor variations of the virus were circulating in the same village, even in the same household, and on one occasion 2 young brothers who shared a bed had different variants of the virus, proving that they could not have caught it from each other or even the same third person. William J. Jordan in 1958 and P.G. Mann in 1981 came to similar conclusions about the lack of spread with families. Another indication that something is wrong with prevailing theories is the failure of the vaccination program. Although vaccines have been proven to confer some immunity to particular strains of flu viruses, several prominent virologists have admitted over the years that vaccination has done nothing to stop epidemics and that the disease still behaves just as it did thousands of years ago. In fact, after reviewing 259 vaccination studies from the British Medical Journal spanning 45 years, Tom Jefferson recently concluded that influenza vaccines have had essentially no impact on any real outcomes, such as school absences, working days lost, and flu-related illnesses and deaths. The embarrassing secret among virologists is that from 1933 until the present day, there have been no experimental studies proving that influenza, either the virus or the disease, is ever transmitted from person to person by normal contact. As we see here in the next chapter, all efforts to experimentally transmit it from person to person, even in the middle of the most deadly disease epidemic the world has ever known, have failed. That's the end of that chapter. Oh my gosh, it was long. So I will conclude this video. If you guys want me to read more of this book, sorry that my brain isn't working properly today. I'm sick. I don't feel that great. But yeah, I took the time to read this because I have some type of flu virus. And I know 5G technology is enhancing the viruses and And I don't trust technology the way it's being used, especially for surveillance and control. So, yeah, if you want me to read more of that book, I'll do it. But I'm done for now.